Here in the United States, we endure an incredibly dire political situation. The effects of our changing climate grows more and more pronounced as our summers get longer and hotter, and our winters get colder and shorter. From a poverty and inequality standpoint, we are living in a new Gilded Age, as the wealthy elite have never been richer. Tens of millions of Americans face food insecurity, a housing shortage, deadly pandemic, and minimal access to healthcare. Rampant inflation and the ever-rising costs of living have left most Americans balancing on the edge of a knife in which many are but a $700 emergency away from complete economic ruin. Our infrastructure rots. Our SAT scores slowly slip behind the rest of the developed world. Almost every other day there is a mass spree shooting in this country. Meanwhile, our tax money and public resources, which could be utilized to try and fix some of these issues, are instead devoted primarily to corporate welfare and our gigantic military, in which our fellow countrymen are sent off to fight and die in adventurous wars while billionaires loot the treasury. As many of my usual subs are all too aware, there are many challenges facing our nation at this time that the established political order is fundamentally incapable of ever meaningfully addressing, since both mainstream parties are thoroughly bought and paid for by the people responsible for perpetrating these problems in the first place. If one were to go issue by issue plaguing America today, be it homelessness, the pandemic, poverty, inequality, racism, climate change, etc., none of them are profitable with respect to the policies that are sorely needed in order to address them. And yet, despite the fact that these politicians never do anything, without huge amounts of political pressure being placed on them from below, the presidential elections, along with the midterms, are the primary stopping gap for most Americans' political advocacy. To the extent to which the average person is involved, they typically go out and vote, passing off their political responsibility onto others, choosing their favorite politician in a similar manner that they choose their favorite football team or favorite pizza toppings. Meanwhile, election cycle after election cycle, we are stuck making the decision between a giant douche and a turd sandwich. Why is this the case? Well, the short answer is thanks to a carefully manufactured political system that exists to serve the material interests of the wealthy and powerful above all others. As I have discussed in depth in my previous video on the subject, the American political system is riddled with pay-to-play corruption and legalized bribery that actively insulates itself from third parties as to circumvent any potential viability or legitimacy that they could ever hope to build. And there are numerous examples of how America's electoral process is insulated from the potential sway of a third party. One such example is the existence of the Commission on Presidential Debates, a privately owned, bipartisan, not-for-profit which regulates which presidential candidates are allowed to participate at the national debate stage, directly shutting out third-party candidates by denying them access to the platform. Other examples include the numerous ways in which voters are either discouraged from voting third-party thanks to our first-past-the-post, winner-take-all type system, or thanks to the numerous methods of voter suppression in place, from voter ID laws to closed primaries to ballot dumping, to the purging of voters off the rolls, to prematurely closing polling stations during the day of the election, to sore loser laws which make it so you cannot cross over to vote for a candidate that is outside of your party affiliation, etc. I go over all of these examples in detail in my video titled, America, a Rich Man's Democracy, linked in the description below. So if you are interested in a more detailed explanation in the ways in which our electoral system is completely rigged, I recommend you go and check that video out. In the wake of this phenomenon, American leftists have taken three different paths towards their political advocacy. The first, and arguably most common path, has been for many to simply let fear and short-sightedness define their politics by capitulating to the Democrats, voting blue no matter who. The second path has been for many, including a substantial chunk of my subscribers, to simply ignore the presidential election outright and withdraw one's participation at the ballot box. The third path, which I shall be lobbying my case for today, is to vote third party and support third party politicians. We are in need of a third party here in the United States. But not just any third party, but a working class party, a socialist party, a party of American labor, if you will. Now don't get me wrong, third parties do exist, but they lack the funding, the connectedness, and the popular support to be a relevant force at the national stage. A big part of the reason why this is the case is for the reasons stated earlier. Our system is rigged, corrupt, and insulated, and so any third party that seeks to win elections in the United States has their work cut out for them, since doing so is a massive uphill battle. For these reasons, it can be tempting for some to take the ultra-leftist position of rejecting bourgeois elections, burning the ballot box, so to speak, and actively discouraging people from voting. And for those of you who do reject participating in bourgeois elections, for those of you ready to simply write me off as a revisionist or a beta-cuck reformist, for a moment, please, just hear me out. There are a number of reasons why I believe that we should not only be participating in bourgeois elections, but that we also should be going above and beyond by directly volunteering our time canvassing, spreading awareness, trying to get our people elected, and trying to pass laws at a local level that would make working class organizing at the grassroots a lot easier. I believe that we, as communists, as people who possess the knowledge that we do and have the awareness about the world that we have a unique obligation to go above and beyond and to carry out these efforts at a local level. Speaking as a theory nerd myself, it's not enough for us to read the history and the theory, we need to go out and do real practice as well. And so here are a number of reasons listed off as to why we should be concerning ourselves with these bourgeois elections. Number 1. To put it simply, it's effective. Third parties have, can, and currently are in the process of garnering political will and successfully taking power in elections. I gave numerous examples of this in my previous video, from the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, to Salvador Allende in Chile, to the Bolivarian Revolution in Venezuela, to Evo Morales in Bolivia getting elected and then re-elected and reinstalled a year after he had been couped. If moderate socialists can get elected in third world countries, which are operating under far more strenuous political conditions than we are, then there's no reason, given enough time, why a potential working class vanguard party can't do the same thing here in the United States. Number 2. For agitation, education, and propagandistic purposes. Once again, for most Americans, their political activism begins and ends at the ballot box, so it stands to reason that we should meet them where they are since it's clear that on some level they care. For if they didn't, they wouldn't be showing up to vote in the first place. Whilst a socialist presidential candidate may not have a meaningful chance of winning the presidency at this time, they do have a chance of educating people and elevating class consciousness over the course of the race through hosting campaign rallies, political advertising, door-to-door canvassing, and simply getting their name out there and exposing people to the message. During the election itself, we can gather useful intel on how well the message is spreading, since more votes for the socialist candidate is indicative of a rise in revolutionary class consciousness. Number 3. The real potential for a socialist workers' party to consolidate into a full-fledged vanguard here in the US. Using Bernie Sanders as an example, during the 2016 and 2020 Democratic primaries, there was a real grassroots movement behind Senator Sanders' campaign, as he was filling stadiums full of young and enthusiastic supporters, inspiring people to turn out and not only vote, but volunteer their time to support his campaign, and raising tens of millions of dollars worth of small campaign contributions from individual donors, $27 at a time. Unfortunately, Sanders squandered this potential by endorsing the Democratic candidate on both occasions, and ultimately betraying the neonate workers' movement in the making. But the fact that this sort of thing has happened twice in a row now in such a short period of time, in addition to the spontaneous nationwide protests and uprisings during the spring of 2020, tells us that this sort of thing can, and very well will happen, again. Number 4. Pretty much all of the big OG Marxists have been in favor of participating in bourgeois elections. From Karl Marx to Friedrich Engels to Vladimir Lenin to Mao Zedong. I shall now quote two of my favorite passages discussing this question, first from Karl Marx's address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. In it, he repudiates the objectively incorrect line of lesser evilism and fear-based psychology of the modern-day Democrats 170 years ago, as well as emphasizing the need for an independently organized workers' party. Quote, "As soon as the new governments have established themselves, their struggle against the workers will begin. If the workers are able to forcibly oppose the democratic petty bourgeois, it is essential above all for them to be independently organized and centralized into clubs. The speedy organization of at least provincial connections between the workers' clubs is one of the prime requirements for the strengthening and development of the Workers' Party. Here the proletariat must take care. The workers' candidates are nominated everywhere in opposition to bourgeois democratic candidates. As far as possible, they should be League members and their direction should be pursued by all possible means. Even where there is no prospect of achieving their election, the workers must put up their own candidates to preserve their independence, to gauge their own strength, and to bring their revolutionary position and party standpoint to public attention. They must not be led astray by the empty phrases of the Democrats, who will maintain that the workers' candidates will split the Democratic Party and offer the forces of reaction a chance of victory. All such talks, in the final analysis, that the proletariat is to be swindled. The progress which the proletarian party will make by operating independently in this way is infinitely more important than the disadvantages resulting in the presence of a few reactionaries in the representative body. If the forces of democracy take decisive terroristic action against the reaction from the very beginning, the reactionary influence in the election will already have been destroyed." Unquote. Karl Marx, 1850 Address to the Central Committee of the Communist League. And there you have it. Karl Marx directly debunking democratic political doctrine 170 years ago. This is why more American self-identifying progressives need to take some time to read and study Marx, because if you don't keep up with your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Next up, I'd like to go through some passages in Vladimir Lenin's Left-Wing Communism. Quote, "Should we participate in bourgeois parliaments? It is with the utmost contempt and the utmost levity that the German left communists reply to this question in the negative. Their arguments? In the passage quoted above we read, quote, all reversion to parliamentary forms of struggle, which have become historically and politically obsolete, must be emphatically rejected, unquote. Parliamentarianism has become historically obsolete. That is true in the propaganda sense. However, everybody knows that this is still a far cry from overcoming it in practice. Capitalism could have been declared, and with full justice, to be historically obsolete many decades ago. But that does not at all remove the need for a very long and very persistent struggle on the basis of capitalism. In the first place, contrary to the opinion of such outstanding political leaders such as Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, the German lefts, as we know, considered parliamentarianism politically obsolete even in January of 1919. We know that the lefts were mistaken. This fact alone utterly destroys, at a single stroke, the proposition that parliamentarianism is politically obsolete. It is for the lefts to prove why their error, indisputable at that time, is no longer an error. By failing to fulfill their duty to self-criticize and give the utmost attention and consideration to the study of their patent error, the lefts in Germany and in Holland have proved that they are not a party of a class, but a circle, a group of intellectualists and of a few workers who ape the worst features of intellectualism. Second, in the same pamphlet of the Frankfurt group of lefts, which we have already cited in detail, we read, quote, the millions of workers who still follow the policy of the Center, the Catholic Center Party, are counter-revolutionary. The rural proletarians provide the legions of counter-revolutionary troops, unquote. Page 3 of the pamphlet. Everything goes to show that this statement is far too sweeping and exaggerated. How can one say that parliamentarianism is politically obsolete when millions and legions of proletarians are not only still in favor of parliamentarianism in general, but are downright counter-revolutionary? It is obvious that parliamentarianism in Germany is not yet politically obsolete. It is obvious that the lefts in Germany have mistaken their desire, their political ideological attitude, for objective reality, even if only a fairly large minority of industrial workers, and not millions and legions, followed the lead of the Catholic clergy, and a similar minority of rural workers follow the landowners and kulaks. It undoubtedly signifies that parliamentarianism in Germany has not yet politically outlived itself, that participation in parliamentary elections and in the struggle on the parliamentary rostrum is obligatory on the party of the revolutionary proletariat specifically for the purpose of educating the backwards strata of its own class, and for the purpose of awakening and enlightening the undeveloped, downtrodden, ignorant rural masses. Whilst you lack the strength to do away with bourgeois parliaments, you must work within them because it is there that you will still find workers who are duped by the priests. Otherwise, you risk turning into nothing but windbags. In September to November 1917, did we, the Russian Bolsheviks, not have more right than any Western communists to consider that parliamentarianism was politically obsolete in Russia? Of course we did. For the point is not whether bourgeois parliaments have existed for a long time or a short time, but how prepared the working class is to accept the establishment of the Soviet system and the dissolution of bourgeois parliaments. It is an absolutely incontestable and fully established historical fact that in September to November of 1917, the urban working class and the soldiers and the peasants of Russia were exceptionally well prepared to accept the Soviet system and to disband the most democratic of bourgeois parliaments. Nevertheless, that these elections yielded exceedingly valuable, and to the proletariat highly useful, political results has, I make bold to hope, been proved by me in the above-mentioned article. The conclusion which follows from this is absolutely incontrovertible. It has been proved that, far from causing harm to the revolutionary proletariat, participation in a bourgeois democratic parliament, even a few weeks before the victory of a Soviet republic and even after such a victory, actually helps that proletariat to prove to the backward masses why such parliaments deserve to be done away with. It facilitates their successful dissolution, and helps to make bourgeois parliamentarianism politically obsolete. Unquote. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, Leftwing Communism, an Infantile Disorder. In summary, Lenin explains that while bourgeois democracy might be a sham, most working people are not aware of this fact. Most workers perceive the bourgeois electoral system with a veil of undue legitimacy, and that it is our job to help the masses recognize the truth, and to utilize these facts to our advantage to delegitimize the capitalist parliament, and to build sufficient trust with the public in order to carry out its abolition and then socialist construction afterwards. Vladimir Lenin was way ahead of his time, and there is so much that we can take away from his brilliant writings. And I notice that we, as Marxists, only begin to start running into trouble when we start deviating away from the core theory that has withstood the test of time and been vindicated by the history. Alternatively, we can align ourselves with the likes of the Gonzaloite ultras whom are adamantly in favor of the electoral boycott. And I think they might just be onto something. Yes, let's just ignore the lengthy history of socialist parties winning elections and successfully utilizing bourgeois parliamentarianism to advance their agenda, so that we may instead redirect that energy towards far more productive revolutionary activities. Why waste our time trying to seize state power, getting socialists elected, and exposing the inherent flaws and shortcomings of bourgeois democracy to the public, when we could instead be tipping over trash cans, harassing DSA liberals, blowing up children's swing sets, and executing people's dogs? Clearly, it should be obvious to everyone by now that actions such as these, along with sitting around and pontificating online about how we're the most advanced cadres who've got everything figured out, while everybody else is revisionist, rightist, reformist, dogmatist, etc., is the proper way to go. That joke aside, regardless of which third party you support, I think it's safe to say that any socialist third party operating within the US has a great deal of challenges awaiting them that they need to overcome if they wish to succeed. I'm primarily referring to the blatant pay-to-play corruption, as well as a slew of anti-democratic legislation enacted at the state level which deliberately drives down turnout and diminishes voter participation. I've already mentioned a few examples, such as voter ID laws, sore loser laws, first past the post, voter suppression, outright electoral fraud, etc. And while there's not a lot that we can do in the short term when it comes to these anti-democratic levers at the federal level, there are reforms that we can struggle for at the state or county level, which would make socialist organizing easier, and the outcomes of elections a great deal more favorable to leftist candidates. For example, the Orwellian titled right-to-work laws make it very difficult for labor organizers to start new unions in their workplaces, since their employers can arbitrarily fire them at will. Repeal right to work within a given state, and you make it easier for workers to unionize in said state. Then there's democratic reform. Get rid of voter ID laws and sore loser laws, and all of the sudden, you get more people able to turn out and vote. Higher voter turnout tends to bias the election result in the favor of the more progressive candidates. How about campaign finance reform? How about ballot initiatives or electoral reform? How about a campaign for greater electoral integrity so the Democrats and Republicans can't just rig the voting machines? Why not launch a public investigation into this phenomenon of electoral fraud? These are just a few immediate examples which come to mind, but if we can fight and win these concessions in the short term, we can start generating the political momentum needed for further reforms and concessions over time. Once we've won a few victories for labor, no matter how minute, it will irrevocably snowball and lead to greater activism, greater enthusiasm, and heightened levels of morale, radicalization, and participation amongst the workers. As of now, the system heavily depends on people feeling apathetic and discouraged. It thrives on demoralizing, manipulating, and terrorizing the general public into submission. But once people see that another way is possible, they will come around. I assure you, 10 times out of 10, they will come around. And when we can't get certain reforms, such as single-payer healthcare enacted at the national level, we can utilize the system's failure to reform as propaganda to undermine its legitimacy. Ultimately, this is what Force the Vote should have been. Senator Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez could have floated Medicare for all to Nancy Pelosi's desk back in 2021. And when she inevitably shoots it down, AOC and her allies in Washington could have then ran a slew of attack ads against Pelosi for it. A similar method could have been utilized by Joe Biden to discipline Senator Manchin for obstructing his infrastructure bill. Biden calls Manchin into his office and tells him to vote on this bill, or else he'll primary Manchin in the next election with a candidate who will fall in line behind Biden's agenda, running attack ads and propaganda against Manchin's re-election campaign, undermining his perceived public legitimacy, and effectively bringing an end to his political career. Unfortunately, the Democrats are cucked and completely insincere, so they will never do anything like this. As far as I'm concerned, that whole infrastructure bill debacle played out just like a professional wrestling bout, in which Biden played the babyface and jobbed for Senator Manchin, who was the designated heel of the match. And hell, I'm pretty sure Manchin was actually in favor of this infrastructure plan all the way up until he got elected, changing his position after the fact since the Democrats need a fall guy to blame for why they can't enact their agenda. Irrespective of scale, be it local or national politics, in order to get what we want, we need leverage which we can wield against the capitalists. A well-organized workers' party, with additional support and backing from the unions, could wield massive amounts of leverage, both politically and economically, which it could use to force through these demands. This is something that progressives and social democrats really need to come to terms with. You will never wrestle concessions from your class enemy by collaborating with them, operating on their terms, and groveling for scraps on their terms. The truth is that the political work that is needed in order to bring about socialist revolution is the exact same type of political work that needs to be done in order to bring about these political and economic reforms. This is what I have to say to the self-identifying social democrats and progressives listening to this video right now. You need people like me. The people that you regard as tanky, red-fash authoritarians are the people that you depend upon in order to win these concessions in the first place. There is no Franklin D. Roosevelt without a large communist party and the IWW. There is no civil rights reform without a civil rights movement and the Black Panthers. And the fact of the matter is that all of the most relevant and prominent faces leading all of these progressive movements are people that you would regard as tankies. So to grant all of the credit for these reforms to the politicians of their respective times is an egregious distortion of the history, because the politicians wouldn't have done anything without a well-organized and disciplined revolutionary threat directly lighting a proverbial fire under their asses. All of this brings me to my next point, that there can be no revolution at the ballot box. Even if a socialist president did get elected, the US government, military, Wall Street, and deep state would consolidate into a giant reactionary mass and quickly maneuver to depose said presidents and administration in a coup d'etat. They did it to Salvador Allende in Chile, they did it to tons of other democratic governments across Latin America, and they were ready to do the same thing to FDR during the early 1930s when he was trying to save capitalism from the capitalists. For those of you that are curious, I suggest you Google the business plot, or check out the articles that I linked in the description for details. So let me stress that winning the presidency should not be our sole primary goal. The presidential elections, along with the state and local elections, are but a means to an end. A tool at our disposal which we can utilize to build the real movements behind the scenes, since these elections are the primary stopping gap for the average person's political advocacy anyways. We can use these elections to push for reforms which advance our agenda, and whenever the political apparatus suppresses us, or fails to reform, or actively goes against our agenda, we can utilize this as propaganda to delegitimize it in the eyes of the public. If we can delegitimize the US government, which at this stage shouldn't be too hard given the general lack of confidence and historically low approval ratings, we can send it into a political crisis that will open the door to socialist revolution. This should be the primary focus of all socialists here in the US. If a legitimacy crisis can kill the Soviet Union, it can certainly kill the US regime as well. All of that being said, it is finally time for us to wrap things up here. Which third party should you involve yourself with? Well, you've got some options. I think the Party for Socialism and Liberation, the Democratic Socialists of America, and the Green Party are excellent starting points for those of you who are currently uninvolved. Out of all of the political orgs that I'm aware of, these three in particular, that is the PSL, the DSA, and the Greens, are three of the most prolific and prominent organizations out there. Now, they all have their pros and cons. The PSL has a minor personality cult surrounding Gloria La Riva, and in practice it is little more than a glorified protesting club. The DSA are a multi-tendency party with reformist leadership, and the Green Party is ran and controlled by opportunists like Cornel West, as well as left-liberal cranks like Jill Stein. But again, they're all good starting points for anyone looking to get involved in their local left. So I suggest you pick your poison. The DSA has a surprising number of Marxist-Leninists within its ranks, and out of all three organizations named thus far, they happen to be the easiest ones to get in touch with, based on my own personal experience. The PSL, on the other hand, is much smaller, less prolific, and significantly more difficult to get in contact with and join. But they are, at the very least on paper, an actual Marxist-Leninist vanguard. And though the Green Party has some questionable leadership and allocates far too much of its national resources and time on the presidential elections, it is, unlike the Democratic Party, an actual democratic institution which can potentially be reconstituted into a full-fledged socialist party down the line. Again, there are pros and cons to each one of these groups, and I suggest you survey your local political landscape to see what you can find and decide what is best for you. Don't be too picky about it, though. Like it or not, these are the people that you have to work with. If there's a DSA chapter in your area organizing a union, see about reaching out to them and getting involved. Is there a PSL chapter in your area up to some good work? At the same time, get involved. Is the Green Party running candidate in local or regional elections? Once again, get involved. The only organizations that I will advise against getting involved with are organizations that either 1. Tails either of the two major established bourgeois parties, or 2. Resembles a cult. The CPUSA is the prime example of that first thing described, a so-called Marxist party that tails the Democrats, full of aging leadership that lives off of its dues-paying party members. I get that they are the same Communist Party that rose to prominence in the 1930s, but even in their prime they weren't that great, as the original CPUSA went full Browderist reformist and ended up squandering their moment in time when they could have accomplished so much more. And then you have all of these small fringe groups full of weirdos that are literal cults that revolve around their leadership. From Bob Avakian and the RCP, to Caleb Maupin and the CPI, to Angelo DeAngelo and the PCUSA to a lesser extent. Let's be real, the PCUSA is really just his retirement scheme. To the deranged psychopath Ghazi Kodzo in charge of Black Hammer. To the Austin Fed guards tipping over trash cans and harassing DSA volunteers. Learn how to identify cults, familiarize yourself with the social pathology of said cults, recognize the patterns, and recognize when you are being indoctrinated. Stay away from cults. That's all I have to say for now. Thank you for listening. Now get out there, agitate, educate, and organize.